There's a lot of suffering about at the moment, isn't there? Did you know there was a book written some 4,000 years ago that speaks about a man who suffered? It's probably the oldest book you could ever read in English. It's the book of Job in the Bible. And it speaks of a man called Job. He was a good man. But, you know, often when suffering comes, people talk about the fact that why does suffering happen to good people? Or maybe it seems that evil people get away with things, but and good people seem to suffer. The stories about Job. I've done a little example here of Job being down here and God being up here, because Job was a God-fearing man, and he always tried to do the best thing, you know. But Job was also a very rich man, and Job was a farmer, and he had quite a lot of cattle and sheep and all sorts of things. In fact, the Bible tells us that he had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. I think that's probably about 1,000, and 500 donkeys. And also, Job had a big family. He had 10 children. And one day, Job's children were in a house all together having a party, and someone came running up to Job and told him something quite terrible. What they said was this. They said, "Job, we were out there on the hills with your donkeys and your camels, and a group of Sabaeans came and attacked us, and they stole all of your sheep, and in fact, even worse, they killed all of your servants, and I'm the only one left here to tell you the story." And while he was just finishing up speaking, someone else came running towards Job and said, "Job, you know the sheep that were on the hills, those 7,000 sheep? Well, a great big fire came from heaven and struck those sheep, and it not only killed the sheep, it also killed all the servants except for me, and I've come down here to tell you that has happened." And while he was still speaking, someone else came running down and said, Job, you know your 3,000 camels? Well, another group of people, the Chaldeans, came rushing down from the hills in 3 raiding parties, and they stole all your camels and killed all your servants except for me, and I'm the only one here left to tell you the story. And while he was just finishing off speaking, someone else came running towards Job, and I reckon Job at that point said, "Oh no, not the kids." He said, "Job, I've got something terrible to tell you. There was a great big wind that came from the desert, and it blew against the house, and the house collapsed, and it killed all your children. And it not only killed all your children, it also killed all your servants in the house as well. And I'm the only one left here to tell you the story." And the Bible tells us that Job fell down in worship before God. And he said, "Naked I came into the world, and naked I shall go out. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." It's quite amazing that Job didn't curse God at that point, but he didn't, and his life continued. But the story also continues that Job, it didn't end there, because it wasn't long before Job was struck down himself with some terrible illnesses. In fact, he was struck down with boils and sores all over his body, and it was so bad, you know, that it says he sat in a heap of ashes, and he actually scraped his skin with some pottery because his sores were so bad. In fact, he was afflicted from sores from the top of his head right down to the soles of his feet. And you know, Job was not only lost everything, he'd also now lost his health. Job was in a pretty bad way. And you know, even Job's wife said to him, "Job, why are you holding on to your integrity? Why don't you curse God and die? In other words, why don't you forget God? God obviously doesn't care about you, Job. But have you noticed that during that time, something was happening to Job? I'm sure you can see. On top of that, some other people came and spoke to Job. They were supposed to be his friends. And his 3 friends came and they gave him all sorts of ideas why this might have been happening. Job, perhaps you've been a real bad man. Perhaps secretly you haven't been such a good man as you appear. And they began to ask questions, but they didn't really have any answers at all. A lot of the stuff they said was right, but actually they had no real understanding of God or who he was. They tried to give Job crass answers about what had happened. But you know, nobody really had any answers. In the end, even Job himself began to ask questions of God. And he said, God, why has all this happened? In fact, Job even got to the position where he said he cursed the very day that he was born. Why on earth was I born to this? Job had really suffered. You know, suffering really does make us ask serious questions, doesn't it? And you know, I don't know about you, but we're certainly facing some suffering today. Maybe you've suffered already, and I know I've suffered in the past, and when that happens, you know, suffering really hurts, but suffering can either drive you from God or can do what's happening to Job and draw him even closer to God. You know, at the end of the story, it tells us that God didn't give Job any crass answers. In fact, he didn't really give him any answers at all, except to say to Job, Job, what do you really understand? Were you there when I formed the world? Were you there when I created things and made them come into being? And Job realised that actually there was very little he knew about God, or even about himself or about the world. But he did realise that God really did know and God really did care for him. The interesting thing is this, God doesn't give any answers to Job, but he just says, Job, what do you really know about this? What do you know really about life? But at the end, it's interesting that God restored to Job all the things that he had before. In fact, the Bible tells us that he blessed him even greater than what he had before. And the things he restored to him was his family and even more goods. But you know, suffering really does make us ask some questions. But it's really interesting that it's interesting also that later on God himself suffered in the Lord Jesus Christ when he came and died on a cross to bring us closer to God. Perhaps that's what the story is about, that God was telling us that even he suffers, and God in his suffering draws us closer to himself. I hope you found that useful. You know, it's a very short synopsis of the story of Job. Perhaps one day you can read it for yourself. Thanks very much for listening. Hello again. What does the book of Job tell us about suffering? Well, there's a number of different explanations by experts, but I'm not saying any one of them is right, but they're all worth a consideration. Let's think about the first one. We all live in a fairly insular way. In the space of time, if you imagine time, the whole of time being from here to here, the little bit that we take up is very small. In fact, you'd hardly be able to see it in if that was the space of time. So, if you like, perhaps instead of looking at our lives and as things that perhaps we suffer as an individual point, maybe if we consider it this way, that maybe our lives are part of a great big picture, as if you can imagine, God as the director of the film, the whole film from beginning to end, and each one of us has got a part to play. Now, some of those parts are going to be really happy and amazingly joyful, and like just like our lives, some of those parts are going to be very difficult. But what if in a play your part was to walk on and break your leg and then walk off? And perhaps you'd like to say to the director, "Well, I don't like that part. I'd like a happy part." But perhaps as God as the director, we don't have a choice of the part we play, because our part does fit into the whole picture. But if you could see the whole picture, the whole play, then perhaps you'd understand your part. And that's very difficult for us to understand the whole of God's film, if you like, or whole of God's play that he's working out from day to day. So maybe that's one way of looking at it, that whatever happens in our lives will have ripples later on in life for other people. And just like Job says, should we accept good from God and not evil? That's one way of looking at things that happen in our lives. There's another one. Satan, who in the book incidentally is called the Satan in Hebrew, the accuser, comes before God and says to God, "Is Job righteous for no reason?" Perhaps he was effectively saying, perhaps God, you're the fool, because maybe Job is just manipulating you, and he's not righteous at all. He's just doing it for his own good, because that will be evil in itself, for Job to be manipulating God just so he could get his own way. And so the gauntlet's laid down, and of course the Satan comes back another time and says to God, well, he's still not cursed you, but if you hurt his body, of course he will. And then of course eventually Job suffers, not only losing everything and his children, he also loses his health. And but Job still holds on to his integrity, and he doesn't lose his righteousness. That's absolutely amazing that he doesn't do that. I wonder how you and I would be in the face of suffering in the way that Job suffered. But effectively, Job answers his own question, answers the question that's asked of him. He doesn't fall down. He's not just manipulating God. Job really is a good man. One other thing worth considering, I'll just go back to that for a second, just apply it to our own lives. How do I react when things go wrong? Do I throw my teddy in a corner and say to God, "Oh, I've got nothing to do with you. If you're going to treat me like that, I'm going to give up being a Christian"? Or do I say, actually, God, I don't really understand why this is happening. I'm going to keep on serving you whatever happens. Another explanation might be that suffering is there to change us. Maybe even little insignificant bits of suffering, just things that annoy us, minor frustrations, are actually there because they're vehicles of transformation for us to become better people. Maybe God allows us to go through certain things, however severe they are, because that enables us to change. That enables us perhaps to become more compassionate or more understanding or more patient or whatever that might be. Because there's no doubt about it, and when I've gone through things in my life, I've certainly been able to say afterwards, now I understand what people are going through when they face something like that. And I'm sure you found that when someone has been through a similar piece of suffering that you are going through, they understand in a way that everybody else doesn't quite seem to understand in the same way. Christopher Reeve, who was Superman in a film some years ago, I don't know if you remember, but he suffered an accident and became a paraplegic. And at first of all, he wanted to die, but eventually, after speaking to his wife, she convinced him that his life was still worth something. And he became an amazing man who worked to campaign for disabled people. He set up what was called the Reeve Foundation, which helps people with paralysis. And I'm told that even he said about himself, I became a better person after all that trouble and difficulty I went through. He said this: what I do is based on powers that we all have inside. The ability to endure, the ability to love, the ability to carry on and to make the best of what we have. And you don't have to be Superman to do it. Amazing. He changed completely. And he was able to do things for other people that perhaps he would have never done if he'd have continued with the life that he, of course, would have wanted. A life of being famous, a life of being looked up to as a great actor. But he changed through suffering. And maybe God allows us to go through suffering to enable us to change, or even to cause us to change. God was also perhaps showing Job that he was just there for him. Job had lost so much. He lost his family, he lost his health, he lost all his income and his goods. And he was asking God questions about these things, and God never really answered the question. But you could argue by the way God did answer. He took Job on a National Geographic tour of the world, and he showed Job what he had made and how powerful he was. Maybe he was just showing Job that all Job really needed was him. And he would be there for him whatever happened, in whatever circumstances. You see, there was lots of things in life that Job, and us of course, will never understand. But God was just saying to Job, I'm there for you, whatever happens. Just one last thing I'd like to say is that, of course, the whole Bible shows us that God is working out salvation for all who will come to him. He came in human flesh and suffered for you and me. Maybe our suffering and the part that we play is all part of this big picture that God is working out, and those difficult things that happen to us, although they might be difficult in themselves and trying and frustrating and make us sad, maybe that part is part of what God is doing in this world to work out salvation for us and for other people. And I believe that in years to come, in the ages to come, we'll look back and see some of what God was doing through us and through the part that we played in this big tapestry that he is weaving together, which we call life and eternity. Well, interesting book, and interesting to look at the subject of suffering. And I hope you found that useful today, and do hope you'd have a good week, and that will give you something to think about. God bless you. See you again soon.